Good afternoon and welcome to the seventh in our series of Urban Transport Next conversations with a live online audience on the topics that will help determine the future of urban transport. So whether you're spending your lunchtime with us listening live, or whether you're listening to the podcast later or watching the playback on YouTube, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan Bray, Director of the Urban Transport Group, the organisation that's hosting these events. For those of you who don't know us, we bring together the public sector transport authorities for the largest urban areas, including Transport for London, but also for other big city regions like Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, Tyne and Wear, and all the other major metro areas, serving over 20 million people. As well as being a body that thinks ahead about what next for urban transport, our members can implement that thinking on the ground and can and do learn collectively from these events. And we are particularly pleased today to have as our guest Andy Byford, Commissioner of Transport for London, and we'll learn more about Andy over the course of the next hour. And delighted also that our interviewer is Joe Field, the Managing Director of JFG Communications and the President of Women in Transport. You can also be part of the conversation, and you can be part of the conversation in three ways. Firstly, by putting questions, keep them short and sharp via the questions box on the Zoom channel. You can also vote for your favourite question. We'll be picking those up in the final section of the conversation. And you can also use the comments channel of the Zoom. And of course, you can also use Twitter with the hashtag UTGNext, hashtag UTGNext. And with that, I will hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Jonathan. And hello, Andy. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us as well. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I actually spent 9 years working for Transport for London before I set up my consultancy. So I've obviously got the insider view of the scale and the complexity of the challenges that TfL faces every day and the amazing job that I think you do to move millions of people every day. I remain a big advocate for TfL and everything you do, and particularly everything you've done to keep London moving during the pandemic. So I'm really, really pleased to be having this conversation today. I've got lots of questions for you, Andy. What I've tried to do is arrange them into themes to make it easier for people to follow. So we're going to start with a sort of general overview, introductory type questions. Then we're going to move on to the topic of diversity, which is obviously one of my favourite topics with my Women in Transport hat on. And then, of course, we'll talk about the pandemic and what comes next after us and after that. And I know, obviously, that the audience is going to have lots of questions they want to ask as well. So as Jonathan says, please do put those in the chat, and we'll have time to bring in questions from the audience later on. So first of all, to kick us off, can you tell us how and why did you get into working in public transport in the first place?
Well, that's a great intro question, Joe. And first I should just say, everyone remembers you with great fondness at TfL. So it's a big shout out from your former colleagues.
Thank you.
You certainly haven't been forgotten. Well, it's 32 years for me now. I can't believe it. Where did that go? One minute I'm a spotty graduate trainee station foreman at Regent's Park on the Tube. I started as a foreman, and somehow 32 years later, here I am being interviewed by you as the commissioner, for which I'm very proud. So how did I get into it? In a way, partly by accident. I grew up in Plymouth in Devon, a big Navy city, and I thought very long and hard about going into the Navy, actually, either the Royal Navy or the Merchant Navy, for various reasons, and didn't, and ended up going to university instead. I studied languages at university, and I always had an interest in transport, though. It was always it's partly in my blood. My granddad drove a bus for London Transport for 40 years. He was at Loughton Garage out in Essex, and he drove through the Blitz, which is something we're very proud of as a family. And my dad worked for London Transport for a little while. So having toyed with various career options, I remember going to a careers fair. It was the day of a strike, actually, and the poor person in the LUL booth looked somewhat harassed and was very delighted when I said, "Well, I'm interested in a career with you." And so, here we are, 32 years on. It's taken me from the Tube to British Rail, or as was British Rail, to Sydney Rail Corp, the Toronto Transit Commission, New York City Transit, and now here. and I've certainly not looked back. It's a passion I have for transport. I've never I had a driving license. I believe in public transport, and I very much enjoy serving the public and being a public servant and doing my bit to keep London moving and for the environment.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's good to hear your passion, Andy. And obviously, you mentioned spending some time in North America. So, what were the highlights of the time that you spent in North America, do you think?
Sure. Well, I was very proud of my time at the Toronto Transit Commission because that was my first CEO job. So, they always say, funny enough, back to the Navy analogy, the commander always remembers their first command. That was my first job as the big boss, at top of the pinnacle. I've been the COO, Chief Operating Officer in Sydney Rail Corp, and that was great. But to actually run the TTC was both exhilarating and daunting, really, because you realise you are the boss. The buck stops with you. So I was very proud of what we did there as a team, and that includes what we did in terms of diversity, which I'll elaborate on when we get onto that section. But basically, as a team, we took an organisation that had been somewhat the butt of jokes in Toronto. It was suffering from all sorts of underinvestment and problems with its reputation. And I remember one of the newspapers described it as a demoralized shambles in 2012. 5 years later, having put together and executed on a plan which was anchored around a vision statement of a transit system that makes Toronto proud. We delivered on 5 major projects. We really addressed basics, and we drove up a lot of customer sat and punctuality statistics. And we won the APTA, American Public Transportation Association, APTA Outstanding Transport System of the Year award. So I was very proud of that, the fact that we went from a shambles, not my words, newspapers, to the APTA Outstanding Transit of the Year. Then went to New York City. It was a real dream for me. It doesn't come much bigger than New York City Transit. And although I was only there for 2 years and left of my own accord, and largely political reasons I left, I was very proud of the fact that, again, we drove punctuality in that 2 years from a woeful, embarrassing 65% of trains on time. We took it up to over 80% by focusing on basics. We also put together the Fast Forward plan and secured nearly $40 billion of funding from Albany, the state capital. So there's still lots to do over there. But now I'm at TfL, and goodness knows there's plenty to do here.
Absolutely, loads to do here. I like the kind of zero to hero theme that you brought in with the Toronto work. And you've mentioned obviously lots to do here. So which of those learnings from Toronto or New York have you brought to London, or do you want to bring to London?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I've made it a bit of a niche, actually, to go into organizations at challenging times. And they certainly don't come much more challenging than this, Joe. I mean, I knew walking in that obviously I was inheriting an ongoing issue with COVID. And a big shout out to my predecessor, Mike Brown, the previous commissioner. He did a stellar job in the first half of the COVID crisis. Obviously, my job now is to, with my executive and the whole team, the whole TfL team, take TfL through and beyond the COVID crisis, plus to get the Elizabeth line open. Those are two top equal priorities that I've set the organisation. So I think the main learning points from elsewhere would be, you've got to have a plan, you've got to have a vision, you must bring your people with you. And that was something I've always felt very strongly as a manager, even as a duty station manager back in my very nascent days as a manager. It's all about the people. Anyone can manage with a big stick or through coercion. That might work in the short term. It doesn't work in the long term. You've got to take people with you. And good managers don't just rely on rank. And I'll put it the other way. A weak manager or supervisor can only have recourse to one thing. My hat's bigger than yours. I'm the boss, you're not. That's not management. That's not leadership. You have to take the people with you. So learning points from elsewhere, create a compelling vision, get some consensus around that, get buy-in from across the whole organization. If you can get your whole organization pulling in one direction, notwithstanding the politics of the day and the other pressures, there's pretty much no reason why you can't succeed. And already I feel that we're turning the ship at TfL on 3 critical areas, which I'll be happy to expand upon as we fight COVID.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, quite loud and clear there on having a vision and bringing people with you. So this now might actually be a good time to talk about your vision and your priorities, because I know you've set out 5 clear priorities for TfL. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about these, please?
Sure, and some of them obviously relate to COVID specifically. There's no surprise there. I mean, look, at the end of the day, COVID has ravaged TfL's finances. We're reliant to the tune of 72% on fares through the fare box. It's unheard of in world transport. The norm's around 40 to 45%. So we're in a real mess in terms of finance. We've got to rely on government funding in the short term. So equal priority number 1 of the 5 is to rebuild our finances and to secure from government a long-term stable funding stream, and that is made up of both operating expenditure, operating revenue, and also capital monies. So in the short term, we need some operating support. We believe we can get back to being self-sufficient within 2.5 years. But long term, we need that government support for big capital programs, big ticket items like new trains, new signalling, all things that actually help the national economy. Secondly, we must rebuild our ridership. Obviously, you can't rebuild your finances without getting riders back. So that means providing a safe, orderly, and clean environment to encourage customers to come back. Thirdly, we must deliver on the big ticket projects. So I've made it my personal mission to get the Crossrail project finished and get the Elizabeth line open. That in itself will aid our recovery. What could be a greater, more triumphant symbol of London's emergence and resurgence from COVID than the soon to open spectacular Crossrail? But before that, we've got the Northern Line extension in September. We're working on other projects, the Barking Riverside extension of the Overground, electrifying our buses. There's so much to do. The fourth, I just touched upon it actually, is to have a green agenda and a green recovery. So we're very, very keen to push on with the green agenda and make our contribution to improving the environment for Londoners' clean air with an electrified bus fleet. And fifth, I really feel strongly that you can't do any of that unless you bring your workforce with you. So a fifth equal priority is to create a fairer, more equitable, more diverse organisation at TfL that addresses long-term issues around diversity and representation at senior levels, and that gives everyone the opportunities to excel. I sometimes say to frontline staff on my many trips around the system, if I can make it from station foreman to commissioner, so can you. And I want an organisation where everyone can achieve their potential.
Brilliant. That's good to hear. Thanks, Andy. Now, I'm going to come back to some of those points later, because you've kind of finished there on the point about diverse workforce. I think now would be a good time to move on to my diversity questions. And obviously with my President of Women in Transport hat on, this is an issue that is, it's very important to me. And actually it was an issue that was very important to me when I was at Transport for London as well. I was heavily involved in driving forward TfL's 100 Years of Women in Transport programme, which actually sparked a bit of a movement in TfL, I think, on its own diversity journey, and it really stepped up the game a little bit. And I've sort of watched from afar in recent years at the different initiatives that TfL has been putting in place to improve your diversity. So yeah, I'm interested to hear, what do you think TfL has done or is doing right in terms of improving its workforce diversity, but also what more do you think it can do?
Sure. Well, look, first of all, Women in Transport is an organisation with which I'm familiar, albeit effectively in the equivalents abroad. There's quite a very active participation in a similar forum in Ontario, in Canada. And I used to make a point actually of going along to the sessions because these, particularly the socials and guest speakers, wasn't just for women. I was always honoured to be asked to go and speak at that forum, and so it's something with which I'm familiar, and you do sterling work. And then the second thing, just by way of personal commitment, one of the things I was most proud of, and I alluded to it earlier at the Toronto Transit Commission. The TTC has been in existence since 1921, or prior to that, it was a different type of transport organisation. But it was brought together as the Toronto Transportation Corporation Commission in 1921. So this year is its 100th anniversary. The reason I say all that is when I turned up in 2011, there had never been a woman on the TTC executive, ever, period. Ridiculous. When I left, on merit, and we did it on merit, we were a 50-50 split between men and women. And that made a massive difference to business performance, to the whole vibe of the executive. I think we made better decisions. I remember putting the chief people officer and the IR director, both women, very, very capable women. We put them in charge of what was always going to be very tricky union negotiations to secure a negotiated deal. We secured four-year deals. There was a killer combination of these two very capable women. So I'm personally committed. I get it. It makes sense. Here at TfL, we have some diversity on my exco. We've got women, we've got people of colour, but look, at the end of the day, the job's by nowhere near complete. At the end of the day, we should be reflecting the city that we serve. We have got a very active staff network group, which includes the race and culture, ethnicity, always difficult to say, culture, ethnicity group, upon whom we rely for advice. We have a very active diversity and inclusion group, and a very just lost actually a very capable director, but we've just recruited a black woman of colour who's superb, going to be superb for us in terms of taking that dialogue forward. And we have been introducing things like anonymized CVs and de-jargonizing our recruitment collateral so that it's less but how would I say it? Less inadvertently biased towards white males. You know, it is a very white male dominated industry. So we've tried to neutralize everything and tried to anonymize everything. But I would be the first to say there's a lot more to do.
Thank you. Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that you're putting in place these inclusive recruitment practices and things like anonymized CVs. And yeah, I definitely remember some of the TfL job descriptions being very jargony. And now that you have things like gender bias checkers that you can put job descriptions through, it's definitely good to do some of those things. So yeah, you mentioned having that 50-50 split. Is that something you're aiming towards with TfL then?
Well, ideally, yes. I mean, and of course, diversity is not just about gender diversity. There's ethnic diversity as well. And so certainly I want ultimately the TTC executive, and for that matter, its board, should reflect the city that it serves. This is a hugely ethnically diverse city. That's one of the great things about London. And TfL actually is an organisation, you'll recall this, Joe, from your time, going down through the layers is actually very ethnically diverse, but it does peter out somewhat at the senior levels. So, you can't change these things overnight. I have a very capable executive, and, these people are quality people at the top of their game. But progressively over time, there are ways to, without being tokenistic or I don't really believe in quotas. There are ways in which you can legitimately change that dynamic and that makeup to the benefit of the organization. So we've, as part of that work, remember I talked about rebuilding after COVID. There's really three strands to that. Rebuild the finance, obviously. Rebuild the ridership, obviously. The third element that I introduced when I came is I said, look, why don't we, while we're at it, take the opportunity to we've got to rebuild the morale of the organization, but let's rebuild its capability while we're at it. Let's come up with that compelling vision that really galvanizes, really inspires and motivates the workforce, so that if you're good enough, it doesn't matter what you look like, what your background is, you can achieve the absolute full height of your potential. That's what we want. And rather than that be a top-down imposition from EXCO and the somewhat white male-oriented EXCO that we have, we're going out to canvas what the workforce wants. And that includes seeking ways in which we can legitimately and rapidly make it a more inclusive organization. So it's a work in progress. One thing that kind of works against us, you can be a victim of your own success. Everyone now, diversity rightly is at the forefront of everyone's thinking, everyone being industry and businesses across the UK. Do you know what keeps happening? Real good quality women that we're promoting keep getting snaffled away by other organizations. So on the one hand, it's a mark of success, but it can be frustrating. It's like, damn it, that person was destined for the top at TfL. Maybe we'll lure them back in the future, but we're going to keep at it and keep promoting and selecting and choosing the right people of talent. And I really want that to be a very diverse draw.
That's good to know, Andy. Thank you. And I'm glad you touched on the point about your exco not being very diverse and, actually being quite predominantly white male, because that's definitely something that I thought about a lot when I was at TfL and have continued to think about, because obviously there have been changes in personnel, but yeah, the exco does remain predominantly white male. So I'm just wondering what message you think that sends out to aspiring leaders.
Well, I mean, look, again, at the end of the day, I can't just change that overnight. The only way I could do that really is to say, sorry, folks, you're all out of a job and we'll start again. But, I have a very, very good team. It's been bequeathed to me by my predecessor. He built a great team. But we all get it. We all aspire to the same thing. There will be churn. People will leave. I'm not going to be here forever. Maybe it's an opportunity when I go eventually. How about a female commissioner? Heaven forbid. Why on earth couldn't there be a female commissioner of TfL in the future? I'd love to see that. And certainly where we've lost quality women, for example, we had a fantastic head of buses, a person in charge of buses, who's just gone off to be managing director of one of the TOCs. Good luck to her. You know what? We'll see if we can entice her back at some point. You never know. Maybe we'll succeed. But certainly, I wouldn't want my quality, female and ethnically diverse people within the organization to see a glass ceiling. It shouldn't be that. There's nothing where once upon a time there was this view that it was a very male-oriented profession. Now you've got plenty of women in senior positions in American properties, transit properties, and equally increasingly in train operating companies. So this is a new era, Joe, and we've got to get with the times.
I'm very pleased to hear you saying that, Andy. Yes, absolutely, get with the times, and it would be great to have a female transport commissioner in future.
One day.
One other last question I wanted to pick up on diversity, because at Women in Transport, we have recently carried out a survey in partnership with the All Party Parliamentary Group for Women in Transport. And this was looking at gender perceptions and experiences working in transport. Because really there has been a bit of a gap in knowledge. There's loads of women in engineering studies, women in construction, but we didn't have any robust data on the perceptions and experiences of women and men actually working in transport. And this was just to fill in the gaps about what we already knew anecdotally from our members. And one of the key findings from this survey was that over 2/3 of women, so that was 69% of women in our survey, feel that the transport industry has a macho culture. Mm-hmm. So I'm just interested to get your views on this. Do you think the industry has a macho culture? And I'm including TfL in that because some of the women we surveyed work for TfL. So do you think the industry has a macho culture? And if yes, then what can we do to tackle that?
Sure. Look, I mean, I think there is a bit of that. I think it's changing, and things like the advent of women train operators has absolutely, without question, begun to change the dynamic. If once upon a time, I remember as a very junior manager, it could be quite intimidating, even for a man, walking into a lunchroom of typically white men who'd been on the job a long time. There was a bit of a macho culture. We know how to drive trains, or we're the mechanics around here, we're the engineers. Really the place for either graduates, because I remember graduates weren't particularly popular on the tube. Graduates, your place is somewhere in the office, typing things or doing customer service. And for women, it would be probably pretty much the same. That dynamic's really changing. Now you've got female train operators. That's certainly changed and station staff en masse, actually. I think that changes the dynamic of the actual workplace. And increasingly, with the just different management styles and capabilities of women, and for that matter, people of color, with whom others can empathize, you are again seeing that dynamic begin to change, not just in lunchrooms or on the very front line, but also throughout all layers of the organization. So I'd say, yeah, there's still a bit of a, it's not just macho. I've thought sometimes in some organizations, I've been almost a militaristic culture whereby it's very hierarchical. Back in my day, I remember very early days at the Tube, you almost didn't dare go to the 7th floor of 55 Broadway. And at 55 Broadway, I remember when I first got there were no women's toilets. Why would there be? There was no women directors. Ridiculous. But now, of course, I mean, we've moved out of Broadway, but towards the end of my time there, that was rectified. But it was very much a hierarchical, almost run on military lines organization that without question not only favored a certain dynamic and demographic, a certain demographic, but without question favored that demographic. It favored it, and it also encouraged it to continue. So that had to be broken. It is breaking. It's not, the job's not done yet, but already I think we're seeing a softening of that old regime, and that's without question to the benefit of the organisation and the people we serve.
Sure, and actually, you talking about things like in the past there weren't even any women's toilets on the 7th floor of Broadway. That does show you how far we have come, even though there's more work to do.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And you know what, I'm not beating up my own organisation here. It was the same elsewhere. Look at the TTC. Never been a woman exec. It's just back in the day, it was kind of unheard of. They'd be somewhere within HR, of course, but not seen at the top table. But when I left, as I said, we had 50-50. I had my chief of staff, which is always a difficult job because the chief of staff is a bit of an enforcer. You've heard what the CEO wants. You fellow directors, we're sitting in this room until we get it done. I had this fabulous, tenacious, intelligent, articulate tigress of a woman who I recruited from the city, and she just did that job with aplomb. She absolutely got the exec into line. She was fantastic.
Brilliant. That's a good story to hear. Okay, so I'm going to move on now and start asking you some questions about the pandemic, because obviously that's hot topic, and as you say, you were brought in in the height of the pandemic to turn things around. So, and obviously it's good to have the benefits of hindsight. So with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you would do differently, knowing what you know now, to protect staff and customers during the pandemic?
Sure. I mean, look, at the end of the day, well, the first point I'd like to make, and you kind of touched upon it in your kind intro, I'm very proud of the fact that TfL kept going. There's a very famous wartime poster of our predecessor organisation, London Transport, that features a bus, a tube train, and a tram, and it's got searchlights, and it's sort of 1940s imagery, and it says London Transport, we kept going. I've asked for an update of that poster because this is our moment in the spotlight. TfL, we kept going. We haven't given up. It's ravaged this organisation. I don't just mean financially. We've lost 90 colleagues, 90 valued, wonderful human beings with families have been lost with COVID. Maybe not directly, but they came into the job and they got COVID, so there's a possibility. So look, 90 people that we mourn to this day, so I guess you do look back, and could we have done anything more quickly? We did react quickly as an organisation. We recognised that there was a cluster emerging in terms of bus operators, and working with the companies, the contracted companies, we rapidly sealed the cabs of the bus drivers' workplace. So the actual cabs were sealed up, and we took a whole load of other initiatives in terms of segregation in workplaces and other defensive mechanisms. But I think the real learning point is, at the end of the day, I think an earlier lockdown would have helped. We followed government advice. We followed government advice on mask wearing, etc. This was back in March before I joined. I joined in June. But certainly we want to make sure those lessons are learned, because we're not out of the thick of this thing anytime soon.
No, definitely not. And you've also mentioned working with government. So what lessons do you think you can take away from the pandemic in terms of working closely with national government?
Well, you have to. I mean, obviously, we're working with them not only on the health aspects, and very much right now, in fact, in terms of the whole debate about what's going on with masks and will masks be a requirement on an ongoing basis. But we work with government really closely on the other main topic of the main impact of COVID, which is, of course, the decimation of our finances, and that has really coloured my tenure so far. Really having to fight to get funding for TfL, because literally at one point, Joe, here's an interesting stat for you and the listeners and watchers, viewers. At one point, the ridership on TfL on the subway, the tube, sorry, I still use Americanism sometimes, smack, on the tube, we were down to 5% of normal ridership. Those are down to figures, daily ridership that hasn't been seen since Victorian times. But we did that. We asked customers to stay away such that we could keep the capacity for critical workers. And that campaign worked really effectively. But of course, the trouble was it took the finances with it. So we're progressively negotiating deals with government. We've secured something like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 deals to date, just under £5 billion worth of funding. That's good. But at the end of the day, you can't really run a £10 billion organisation on 6-month deals. We really must get that long-term deal. So I'm working with government all the time, primarily the DfT, but also the Treasury and Number 10. And we're fighting to get a fair settlement for TfL, because as I keep saying to government, at the end of the day, you can't have a national recovery without a London recovery, and you can't have a London recovery without a viable transport system. Don't see us as the problem, see us as part of the solution. You want, government, you want a job fuel, infrastructure project fuel jobs-led recovery. We can help you with that. We've got plenty of projects. You want a green recovery. We can help with that. Let's electrify our buses. And number 3, you want levelling up. We can help with that. We buy our buses in Scotland. We buy our trains. They're being made, new Piccadilly trains in East Yorkshire. We buy our steel in Scunthorpe. So investing in TfL makes sense. So I have the government on speed dial, Joe, rest assured.
I bet you do, Andy. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad you touched on these funding deals, and obviously the latest one, again, very short term. So doesn't that just make it completely impossible for you to plan for the future?
Well, it certainly doesn't make it very easy. I mean, it is, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's just suboptimal. It's most certainly not the way to go about investing in transport, because with a short-term deal, you can't really give contractors, potential suppliers, the confidence that they need, and so they factor in risk. So my argument is that ends up costing you more in the long run, because if they think that, oh, hang on a minute, this client can't commit to us, they might factor in risk. Secondly, you can't really let long-term contracts, because we have a fiduciary responsibility to not incur costs that we can't pay back. So again, it forces short-termism. It's also affected our credit rating. Just the other day, TfL got downgraded 2 notches by Moody's, one of the 3 credit agencies with whom we deal. Now, at the end of the day, that's not good news, because that means that the cost of borrowing potentially is more. So for myriad reasons, we're saying to government, okay, at the end of the day, we're not tone deaf. We get it. The country is in dire straits. The country doesn't have, has been similarly affected. There's not infinite amounts of funding. So I do get that the government will want to get through the comprehensive spending review in autumn before it can maybe commit to a long-term deal. I get that. In the short term, we'll put up with short-term deals. But longer term, we can't carry on like this. We must get to a sensible funding solution with government to our mutual benefit.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I agree. And I guess really what the pandemic has shone a light on is the fact that current transport funding models are not fit for purpose. So what can government and local government and transport authorities do to work better together to come up with a funding solution that does work for everyone?
Yeah, well, just to put it into context, and again, I touched on it earlier, as I said, our funding model is basically broken, because in good times, it just about worked. And to my predecessor's credit, the tube was pretty much breaking even, which is practically unheard of. But again, COVID's driven a cart and horses through that, because we are reliant to the tune of 72% of funding through the fare box for our income. Contrast that with New York City Transit's around 38%. Singapore, I think, is about 40%. That's the norm. So we've got to change that funding model, and you can't just gouge customers. You can't just keep putting up the fares. There's a place for some fare rises to deal with inflation, but I think we need to come up with a much more enlightened, long-term, sustainable funding mechanism. Which, if you play your cards right while you're at it, you address other issues such as congested roads and clean air and a green-led recovery. Because what we don't want is people to suddenly all jump in their cars and we'll end up back with gridlock and toxic air. So my argument would be you need to come up with funding solutions like some forms of road user charging, or maybe a levy on deliveries. There's a debate going on at the moment about should there be a Greater London boundary charge. If you do that properly, you get almost a win-win-win. The Transport Authority gets stable funding that enables it to plan with confidence and to continue to invest and to improve the quality of the product, which means you attract more people into transport, which means fewer people get in their cars, which means it's better for the environment, which means there's less congestion, which means the buses run more smoothly, for example, and therefore more people come into transport and you get more income. To me, there's a virtuous cycle to be played here. The corollary is doomsday, and that is you go on the downward spiral, not the virtuous cycle, the downward spiral, where the roads get gridlocked, the buses get stuck in traffic. People say, oh, you can't rely on the bus, so I'm going to take my car. So we end up cutting service, and down you go. We cannot go there. We just must not.
Sure. Okay. And yeah, you've put lots of ideas in there for how these funding solutions could work. You mentioned road user charging. So does that mean that there are plans to bring more of that in London, perhaps to reform the congestion charge?
Well, look, we're looking at all options. At the end of the day, we are grateful. Let me just say on the record, we are grateful to Her Majesty's government for the support we've received to date in the short-term funding deals we've had. But we do want to partner up for a long-term funding deal going forward. And so what government have said is they're amenable to that, but they do want to see us look at our cost base, because there's two halves to this ledger, Joe. As you know, there's the cost of your operations and there's the revenue that you can bring in. So we need to reduce cost of operations and also drive up revenue from a more diverse field of options. So road use charging is one option. There's all sorts of things you can do. I love the Hong Kong model where the MTR, the Mass Transit Railway in Hong Kong, it's kind of the opposite of most transport companies. It's a development company with a transport arm rather than a transport company with a development arm. They really max their property to leverage over oversight developments, air rights. It's a very enlightened model, and we'd certainly like to do some more of that. Where I just visited just the other day a work site up at Black Horse Road called Black Horse Vale, where we're working with a contractor to convert what was a station car park into affordable homes for Londoners. So rather than sell it off, which we would have done in the past, a one-off fire sale, we build homes, affordable homes, with a contractor, with a client partner. And that means you get then an income stream, ongoing income stream from rentals, and you build more ridership. That's a much more enlightened model that I think we should do more of. So it's a package. Nothing's decided yet. But what we do know is going forward, we have at least £1 billion gap in our budget for now that needs to be filled by new revenue sources.
Thank you for that. And it's good to hear about some of the things you're thinking of, particularly on the commercial development side of things. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to thinking about, what does London look like after the pandemic? Is public transport use going to recover? How are you going to encourage people back onto the network, or what are you doing to encourage people back onto the network?
Right, well, let's start with that one then. What are we doing to encourage people back? It seems to me, and my Exco team, there's three primary elements. It's got to be safe, so socially distanced. It's got to be orderly, people wearing masks, and it's got to be clean. So we're putting huge efforts into all three of those aspects. We've been running full service, or pretty much there or thereabouts, throughout the pandemic, and that's raised a few eyebrows. People have said, why are you running all these empty trains around? Because we want to maximize our capacity such that people can socially distance. We're applying hospital grade levels of cleaning product and periodicity, so frequencies, to keep the system clean. And we're not just doing that, we're checking that independent analysis shows that it is clean. We've had Imperial College in who on a randomized basis check touch points, like gates and lift buttons and that kind of thing, and do air sampling. And to date, in 6 rounds across the system, they haven't found a single trace of COVID. So big shout out to our cleaning teams. And then the third thing is to make sure that it's orderly. And so we put a lot of effort into making sure that people are doing the right thing, wearing masks, etc. In terms of what will the system look like going forward, well, we don't have a crystal ball, but we have very capable analysts and modelers at TfL. It's one of the jewels in the crown of our organization. And we've modeled 5 scenarios ranging from 2 polar extremes, neither of which will happen. They're the super optimistic and the super pessimistic doomsday. So on the one hand, you've got London's finished, that's it. No one's going to go back to work, and the centre of London will wither, and no one will use the transit. I don't think that will happen at all. Ranging through to the within 6 months, you'll never know that there was ever a pandemic, and it will be as packed as it ever was. Again, I don't think that will be the case. We're focusing on the middle option of 5. There's a hybrid in there where public transport ridership will soften, certainly in the short to medium term. I think some organisations may choose not to have all their people working in the office, if in some cases at all, or perhaps 3 or 4 days a week instead of 5. And travel patterns will change. We see more activity potentially in the outer satellite areas of London, or even the inners. The sort of the sub centres, your Harrow, Stratford, Streatham, those kinds of places. So we will have to adjust our model to reflect that, and tweak the system. But I don't think London's done. London's faced huge challenges in the past. I talked about the Blitz earlier. It always bounces back. It's a world city. It's very resilient. So I think certainly getting back to 80% ridership, maybe 90 in the next 18 months is possible. But here's a sobering fact, Joe. 90% sounds great, right? Do you know what that 10% delta represents in terms of revenue a year? £1 billion foregone. So this is serious stuff, right? 90% sounds great, but that's still a massive headache for us to solve. So, as I said in my intro, lots to do.
Yeah, absolutely, lots to do. And just moving back to one of the things you touched upon about, how to encourage people back and making them feel safe and secure. And you mentioned making sure everyone wears masks, and you've mentioned working closely with government on that as well. And obviously we've had the Prime Minister's announcement about the great unlocking on 19th July, and it's likely that mask wearing will go. So, and this is bringing in one of the questions from the audience as well. Will you continue to will you continue to ask people to wear masks, and how would you enforce that if it's not a government policy?
Well, I mean, that's the rub, isn't it? If it's not government policy and it's not the law, then enforcement de facto becomes a lot more difficult. And I'll say what I said the other day. Well, first up, we're still looking at it. We don't have to decide right now. Let's see exactly what government conclude. Let's see exactly what they say on the 19th of July. But in the meantime, we're talking to other parties. We're consulting with our customers. We're consulting with the unions, with business. We're looking to see what the National Rail does, because it would be kind of odd if you can come in on a mainline train into Charing Cross and not wear a mask and get onto the tube and have to. That again won't make things any easier for enforcement. What we're trying to get the balance here is around 60 from our polling, 65% of customers say they feel more secure if everyone's wearing a mask. So we should listen to our customers, but equally, I feel very strongly that I don't particularly want TfL to be this sole outlier, because what message are you sending? Are you almost subliminally sending a message careful, it's dangerous down there, you have to wear a mask still, or it's dangerous on the buses. It isn't. Remember what I said about the cleanliness and everything else. So we're trying to strike the right balance here. We want to make sure we give customers the confidence to come back. We need them to come back. At the end of the day, that's how you rebuild your ridership, through confidence. But equally, I don't want to create a situation where there's huge uncertainty and it becomes a bit of a, almost a shambles, because we're being yelled at to enforce something which is not that easy to enforce without the backing of legislation. So it's still a work in progress, Joe. We're weighing up all the pros and cons, but it's not going to be an easy one to fix, because everyone you talk to has a different opinion.
Sure. Yeah, it's a hot topic. I agree. Mm-hmm. Lots of different opinions in the debate. Okay, I'm going to bring in some more questions from the audience in a minute, but just one more question I wanted to ask about your green recovery priority, and what are the best things that TfL can do to support a green and just recovery from the pandemic?
Sure. Well, job one is to get the bus fleet electrified. We have 9,500 buses. It's by far the largest bus fleet in the UK. And right now, they're all what's called Euro 6 compliant. So they're pretty clean anyway. But what you really want is, the holy grail is to have them zero emission. So it doesn't have to be electrified. We're just trialing hydrogen buses at the moment. There's 20 hydrogen buses being put in on the route between East Acton and Oxford Circus. So we're having a look at that as a technology. But what will really make a difference is to progressively get the whole bus fleet electrified, or as I've said, on hydrogen. And that's going to take a lot of investment. But that's one of the cases we make to government, because government has an aspiration that the UK should be carbon neutral by 2050. That ain't happening without London, right? This is the biggest bus fleet, and London's the biggest city. So our argument is that objective won't be met, but we could do that by 2030, actually. 2030, with whole-scale vehicle renewal and obviously connecting up the garages to charging infrastructure. But also, from a levelling up perspective, well, guess where we buy the buses? They're not made in London. They're made in Falkirk, in Scotland, in Ballymena, Northern Ireland, in the Guildford in Surrey. I think Leeds, there might be a factory as well. So that's levelling up in my book. We're providing quality work for people in the regions. But also, the other factor there is, if you were running a production line in somewhere like Ballymena, you wouldn't set it up for a small municipality of 100 buses, but you would for a TfL. That's 9,500 buses. So then the small municipality can follow on from that. That's how you get volume. So there's lots of other things that we can and should do. We're buying our power now from more sustainable sources. We're really making an effort on that front. We're looking at all aspects of our operation. Our taxi fleet is progressively being electrified. We're looking at putting in, or we are putting in, not just looking at it, putting in more charging points across the system. We installed 300 rapid charging points across London just last year. And we're looking at our own facilities. Can we have more solar panels? Can we have more in terms of carbon reduction at the places that we operate? So it's something that we feel very strongly about. Again, you won't get that decarbonised UK without London, and definitely not without TfL.
Thank you for that, Andy. And I always like to hear the stories about the supply chain and how a TfL contract supports communities all over the UK. It's not just about London.
55p of every pound is spent outside London. So, where people say levelling up is binary, that it's either London gets all the money or the regions get all the money, it isn't. That's facile. It's got to be both. And because we spend so much around the regions, investment in London is levelling up. That's my submission.
That is a really good statistic. Thank you for that. Okay, so I want to bring in some more questions from the audience now. The first one is about the finances, and given the current financial constraints, should investment be focused on maintenance rather than on infrastructure, new infrastructure?
Job one in any transport system is state of good repair. you must maintain what you currently have before you go down the road of expansion. And, that doesn't always sit well with politicians. Everyone wants the shiny new thing. Everyone wants to get the scissors out to cut the ribbon. But as I always say, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory if you've got a shiny extension on an existing line and the trains have to grind to a halt at the boundary because the track's fallen to bits. So what's the point of that? You must keep your existing system safe and in a state of good repair. A lesson from history, or a sort of siren voice, is WMATA, and not everyone would know what WMATA is. It's the Washington Metropolitan Area Transport Authority. If you ever go to Washington DC, the subway, it looks fantastic. It looks like something else. Space Oddity 2001. It's got these groovy stations, and it was built in 1976. But they built it, and then they didn't bother, or they didn't sufficiently invest in it. And progressively, they've had to close sections of it for emergency repairs for months on end. And that's not a good place to be. They've had some nasty accidents. So you must not let your state of good repair degrade. It's false economy. If it's from a TfL perspective, we've cut back on road maintenance. We had to some time ago, but you do that quickly to save a few bob, but you always end up paying more because now you've got a backlog and you're rushing to get potholes filled or to repair tunnel systems, etc., etc. So job one, absolutely maintain your state of good repair across the whole system. Then you can look at expansion.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. And then I guess related to that, although this is more about major projects, what is the outlook, do you think, for large investment in rail and rapid transits over the next 5 years?
Well, look, we really want to continue in that space. I mean, certainly job one is to get the existing schemes finished. So as I said earlier, Northern Line extension is going to open in just a couple of months. The Elizabeth line is tantalizingly close. I was at Tottenham Court Road Station the other day. It looks amazing. And we're into trial running at the moment, and we'll soon be into trial ops. So get the existing schemes done first. And then we absolutely want to push on. There's stuff to do. The Piccadilly line trains were built in 1973. Bakerloo are even older. They're 72. They're 50 years old next year. But we need to renew rolling stock. The PIC needs new signalling, moving block, CBTC, modern signalling would make a real difference on the Piccadilly line. What else? Progressive renewal of the bus fleet. And then, of course, there's two big ticket items which for now have been put on hold. Those being the extension of the Bakerloo line down Old Kent Road down to sort of Lewisham, Camberwell. And then the Crossrail 2, what used to be called the Chelsea Hackney line, which is the southwest northeast diagonal. That's been again put on ice, archived, not wasted money. The work's all been archived, just awaiting more rosy times in terms of finance. But both schemes are still absolutely viable. We want to do them, we need to do them, but for now they'll just have to wait for a little while. So I think there'll be a slight hiatus while we finish off existing jobs, build that, rebuild the ridership and rebuild the finances, and then we can hopefully get back to expansion again.
Do you think there's going to be an issue? Because I'm just thinking how there was like a lot of funding stopped in the 70s and 80s, and Crossrail kept getting cancelled and put on ice. And then you have this sort of gap where the system becomes so overcrowded and it can't cope. Is this what's going to happen because Crossrail 2 has been put on ice as well?
Well, not if I can help it. I mean, look, you saw the state the tube got into in the 1980s as a result of funding basically drying up, and you just cannot afford for that to happen. So we're certainly going to keep pushing the Crossrail 2 case. We're going to keep pushing the BLE, the Bakerloo Line extension. At the moment, they're out of the funding envelope for now, archived, safeguarded. So we're doing the right things. We're safeguarding the routes. But we absolutely want to get going on those again, and we can dust off those business cases pretty quickly. But certainly you stop investing at your peril, because ultimately, as I've said, you always end up spending more. In my experience, it's much better to keep renewing as you go.
Sure, agreed. Okay, we've got time for a few more questions from the audience. I've got a couple here on fares and ticketing related. Mm-hmm. So firstly, do you support the continuation of the senior Freedom Pass? And yes. Secondly, are fare evaders a big problem for TfL?
Okay, so on the first, yes, I do. There's often you're asked about under 16s as well. I mean, at the end of the day, there's always a bit of a controversy around some of these apparent London benefits, because some parts of the country don't necessarily benefit, although they could if they chose to invest in them. And my argument is always, well, London's a very big city, so there's people that actually travel longer distances. But I am supportive of it, and certainly the mayor is very much in that space. Fare evasion is not unique to London. It's a problem across the world. I mean, it used to be rife, or it still is a major problem in New York City. Obviously, at the end of the day, that comes literally at a cost. It's revenue forgone. I think you need to look at who is fare evading, why they're fare evading. You know, is your base fare too high? Should there be more discount schemes for people that really can't afford it? Because the right answer can never be to evade the fare, but in some ways the simplistic answer, and also it's been tried and never properly succeeded, is to just try and arrest your way out of a problem. But certainly fare evasion is a problem. It's anathema to me, because effectively every fare evaded is robbing the system for often people of equal low income, but who do pay the fare. That's just not fair, literally, FAIR. Yes, it's a problem. I think back to all my agencies I've worked at, it's always been an issue. There's probably a certain tolerable level, but you certainly got to really watch it carefully, because if you're not careful, it can really get out of control.
Sure, that makes sense. And one of the points you touched on there was you have to look at things like, is your base fare too high? Do you think the base fare is too high?
No, I mean, the mayor, to his credit, has held the bus fare at £1.55, and that's been the case for a long time. The reason buses are particularly important is because they serve a lot of areas of London where there is no tube, so there's no real alternative. And they also serve a lot of areas of London where there's genuine poverty and there's very low income, serving, though, people who have no choice but to take public transport, probably going off to fairly menial jobs and in the service industry. So they rely on the bus. You can't and you shouldn't just gouge them or try to keep putting up the fare. The single fare here on the tube is high by world standards, but then of course what we're trying to do is encourage people to use Oyster and contactless and gain the discounts that both of those schemes attract.
I think we've got time for just maybe one or two more questions from the audience. One about communications, and obviously you've paid credit to the great job of all the frontline workers who kept London moving during the pandemic. But how do you communicate with your frontline workers? How do you make sure that they hear all the messages that you need to get to them?
A multitude of media, actually. And it's not just me, but I'll talk about what I do. I do a lot of management by walking about. I mean, obviously, we've had to rein that in a bit because of COVID. People are largely working from home where if they don't have to go in. But I do a lot of visits. I really enjoy going to visit every mode, ride the buses, go out on the Clippers, go to the Woolwich Ferry, the Emirates airline, all of the different modes, to go and talk to speak with colleagues and show overt support for what they do. I make an update video every 2 weeks to let my colleagues know what's going on. We use Yammer as a medium of communication. We have newsletters, sort of face-to-face staff meetings. There's a whole multitude of means that we use. We've got in-house magazines, but I cannot stress how much I value the face-to-face. That's how you find out what's going on. You also demystify the exec. I want the frontline staff to hold me to account, and I want them to know you're not some kind of mythical character strolling the 11th floor of the HQ building. You exist, you understand what they do, you empathize with what they do, and you bother to come out and show appreciation for what they do. It's really important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that actually relates back quite nicely to what you said at the start about you need to bring people with you, Andy, and the way you're going to do that is by getting out and about and speaking to them. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I know that Jonathan wants to come in and say the last word, but I think we've got time for one more question of mine, actually, and this is one of my particular bugbears, actually, because I'm also a trustee of Living Streets, so I really champion walking to school. And the school run, I think, is a big issue because, I mean, some of TfL's own research pre-pandemic showed that a quarter of cars on the roads, on London's roads in the morning peak are doing the school run. So what are you going to do to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, if people absolutely are adamant that they want to take their kid in the SUV, I can't stop that. But what we can do is things that we're already doing, like safe school zones. So really making the areas around schools low traffic or low speed in terms of the immediate environment to keep the kids safe. Making the bus service as pleasant and frequent as we can, providing school specials, making sure that we also optimize and promote the use of low emission vehicles, so that at least if people are using their cars, they're not polluting the environment. So I think it has to be a package of measures, Joe, and we've got work in hand across the range of those various interventions. Okay,
so we've got just 1 minute left. So I'm going to invite Jonathan back now because I know he wants to have the last word. But I just want to say thank you so much, Andy. I've really enjoyed speaking to you and hearing all your insights and plans for the future.
Fabulous, Joe. It's been my pleasure. It's been really great to spend an hour with you, and I hope people enjoyed and got some insight into what we're up to. Lots to do. I'm very proud of TfL. Big shout out to all the TfL colleagues out there.
Great. And thanks to Andy and Joe for what was a really good discussion and conversation, quite inspiring. And I think it's exciting to have a CEO of TfL who's combines a real interest and passion for the frontline day job of operating the system, but also takes a progressive view on ensuring the industry better reflects the diversity of places they serve, and also that big picture view of a better London from better transport through better ways of finding funding for that system. And I should also say that TfL has been really great at working with other city regions as part of our network in sharing their expertise and knowledge. And we look forward to continuing to work with Andy and colleagues as we work through the rest of the pandemic and into supporting the green and just recovery we all want to see. We'll be taking a break over the summer, but we'll be back in the autumn. We're plotting some exciting events one around child-friendly cities, another one an interview with Lee Waters, the Transport Minister for Transport for Wales, where they're looking at introducing road user charging across Wales and the Halt with the Road programme. So watch this space. Hope you can join us for those. And in the meantime, thanks again to Andy and Joe and to everyone who took part live, and for those listening into the podcast or watching the playback on YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.